All right, welcome to the Unfazed, Unedited podcast, where we provide commentary on complicated topics in an uncomplicated format. I'm Dr. Shauna Payne Gold, and I go by she, her, hers pronouns. And Dr. Lisa, we're never short on topics. We are
Yep.
trying out yet again this new format that lets us go a little bit deeper on things. So, how
hmm
are you doing today?
I'm doing okay. Hi, everyone. Pronoun she, hers. I am tired because I've been working out in the garden, not working out like exercising, but like
Mm-hmm.
cleaning up and ready for planting stuff. So feeling a little,
Oh, so now
yeah.
is this in the tomato area that you told us about
Yes.
before?
Yes.
Okay, all
It's
right.
it's it's continued work because it's quite a large area that's covered in weeds that I've been slowly but surely excavating.
Mm, mm-hmm. Well, we're not going to complain because look, the many times I've asked, how's the weather? And it's like, oh goodness, I don't want to know. Sounds like weather's good enough to get out there, which is great. So
Yep.
yeah,
Yep.
yeah. Awesome. All right. Well, we are having a good day here in Maryland as well. Got outside, a little bit of a breeze. It was 60-ish around here. So good to get out, exercise, work in your
hmm
yard, go to the park, walk the dog. All those outdoor activities are fun. So, but yeah, I have to get out there, Lisa, to get my mind off of what's going on in the world. And we got a lot going
hmm
on in the world as usual. So let's dive right into our word of the week because you will see how this weaves into a lot of other areas that we'll probably touch on today. But uh, Dr. Lisa, tell us about our word of the week.
Yeah, so we wanted to talk about the word overemployed this week. So you've probably all heard about underemployed and that not enough people have jobs and they're finding it hard to gain employment. But there is a sub group that are actually would fall into this category of overemployed. And so it really kind of accelerated with remote work because if you're working from home, it gives you more opportunity to take on a second job. And so folks were doing that, and in some cases, taking on a third or a fourth job. And so this would be overemployed, where you have one person doing multiple paid positions, ultimately to boost their income because a single job does not pay enough to meet their basic needs. And this
Yes.
phenomenon of overemployed is growing. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Particularly as we think about the economy and we think about the ways in which tariffs are affecting businesses and
Mm-hmm.
how salaries or wages haven't kept pace with inflation and how the cost of housing is
Mm-hmm.
going up. Folks are finding it much more needed to get that second or third job. And I think when I think about this, Shauna, I think about people who have second or third jobs as folks who are maybe working in the hospitality industry, or
Mm.
whether that's in a hotel or in a restaurant or something, and they need a
Yeah.
second job. But it isn't just low wage workers or the group you might understand as low wage workers. It isn't just that
Mm-hmm.
group that is getting the second or third job. It's people who are in kind of office
Yes.
environments or positions that
Yes.
are salaried, right? That they're just not
Mm-hmm.
able to keep pace. And so they're adding that Uber job or TaskRabbit or
Mm-hmm.
some other kind of this gig industry that has built up. So I just thought it was kind of interesting.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. The side hustle language is just bursting out of there in regard to people trying to keep up. It's when folks have more, what's the phrase, more month than money, then
Mm-hmm.
they have to make it work in some way, shape, or form. So we'll get further into depth around who those folks are and why the case is there. But uh, given that, I have to say, Lisa, I'm a guilty party in that for many years. But you're right, this gets really interesting when we start thinking about the rise in the cost of everything, frankly, at this point. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right, well, let's get into phase one, which you all will see why this is so seamless with our word of the week. But what I think is really important to think about now is as we continue to look at data, Dr. Lisa and I love data. Um, yes, there is a quote unquote gig economy, there's a side hustle economy, there's even an overemployed economy. But Lisa, I I think my definition of overemployed was off base in comparison to what the data tells us. Because when I first heard the language of overemployed, I was more so thinking uh, almost similar to overqualified, meaning that,
Oh, okay.
not really necessarily talking about the numbers, as far as how much money you're bringing in and your bills. I was thinking more about qualification side of things. Like,
Mm.
I have, a PhD in physics, but I am in a service industry that may not require that level of
Oh,
education.
okay.
That's what
Okay.
I was thinking as an example, right?
Yeah.
When actually, the US Bureau of Labor Statistics tells us that 8.9 million Americans are working multiple jobs, which is the highest number since they started tracking this in 1994. And these multiple jobs are feeding into this notion of overemployment, meaning that there's this pairing of an economic necessity, meaning that things just cost more, or you have more bills or you have more responsibilities, whatever that may be, and then linking that to the opportunities that are available to us, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, going to your great point around the word of the week, if Lisa works 9 to 5 as a CPA, as an accountant, and that may not afford her coverage of every single bill or responsibility she has, then she may drive Uber at night or train at a local box gym on the side in the evenings and on the weekends to try to make things meet. And so, with that, that still means that, Lisa is a CPA and she's well qualified for the 9 to 5 job that she has, but the gig economy and the rise in cost of everything has almost forced Lisa to say that that 9 to 5 CPA job isn't enough.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so, we have this rise in remote work. And I'll say, Lisa, I am very guilty of this, even though it didn't break any rules or any policies or anything. But during the pandemic, that was that window of time that I really expanded my own business, even though I was
Mm-hmm.
working literally, on the top 10% of earners at my university in the role that I was doing, my dream job that I had always wanted in that particular role.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, life changed for me. Life was more expensive for me. I had more responsibilities, all these things. And so I saw that as an opportunity where, because everyone was remotely working, could still work my day job, but also could still expand my business in a way that allowed me to have more opportunities for income. And where I think the hinge point is with this whole conversation, Lisa, is that I don't think how can I say? I don't think employers or supervisors, unless there's an explicit rule, I don't think employers or supervisors have a problem with side hustle, gig economy if it doesn't uh, decrease the level or the value or the quality of the work that you're doing, right?
Mm-hmm.
So for example, closer to the ending of my higher ed career when I was about to leave anyway, it was no harm, no foul. There wasn't anything negative going on or anything. I just wanted to focus on my own business, so I left higher ed. Well, what was interesting about that, there were conversations at that time where uh, the president at that time felt strongly that no, we should not allow people to have a side job, a secondary job, et cetera. And she wanted to create a policy around that.
Okay.
And so there was some pushback from the president's cabinet itself that was deemed to help create this policy. And it was this aha moment for the president because out of 12 people in the cabinet, 9 of them had what you would categorize as a side hustle or a side job. Like, when your chief of police also is an attorney and they do their own legal work on the
Mm.
side, So it was this aha moment for the president that was like, oh, I had no idea. Some of it was connected to needing a certain amount of income, And for other people, it was just they had a completely different interest. What happens when you have multiple interests of things that you want to do? And it helps to pay the bills. So, Lisa, I think this is an interesting concept. I'm wondering what you're thinking about this piece because I'm not sure if you found yourself kind of one foot in one world and one foot in another world like I did. But what's your thought on this overemployment piece, given its necessity for many people, but sometimes it's ideal for others
Mm-hmm.
with different goals?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. And when kind of reading the research about this prior to us doing this podcast, what I was struck by is the percentage of people who have undergraduate college degrees who are holding multiple positions has increased steadily over the last 5 years, gone up about 5% from 45 to 50%. And so that is curious to me because, as I said in that definition, before this phase, is when we think about people who kind of your stereotypical image, I guess, of a person who holds multiple jobs is an individual who is maybe earning minimum wage or under, right? And so there is that financial necessity. So I think there's an association with needing more than one job with folks who perhaps don't have a college degree, right? Maybe they have or have not graduated high school, and that's not true. That may have never been true, but it's certainly not true anymore, right? And so you actually have people graduating from college with bachelor's degrees, and
Yes.
that bachelor's degree in many cases is not
Hmm.
yielding the kind of income that they need. And so they are getting a second full-time job, whether that's something they're doing in the evening, or, if they have shift work that equals a full-time job, they do two of them, And
Hmm.
so
Hmm. Yep.
the piece that it's raising for me is the ways in which we think about college education and what it can get you, um, which is obviously really it's kind of a hot topic. It has been for a while, right? Several years ago, colleges and universities were required to publish their like employment statistics so that they are supposed to be more transparent. Part of this was related to the kind of for-profit colleges that were
Hmm.
churning people through, getting them in horribly in debt, right? And then the folks weren't getting jobs. And so there was like a push for greater transparency for institutions of higher education to publish the percentage of people who are getting employed.
That's
Um,
right.
and obviously right now, the value of a college degree, I think, is up for debate. And so this
Yes.
kind of these
Yes.
statistics around, well, shoot, I have a bachelor's degree in English literature or a bachelor's degree in biology, but I need two jobs to make ends meet, right? The bachelor's degree no longer is the step up or the qualification that it once was. And I can't afford to do a master's degree or some kind of graduate education, right?
Yes.
So I
Yes.
think I
Yes.
think that's really interesting how that has shifted. And then I wonder also how this fits into the narrative around immigration and people who
Ugh.
are opposed to immigration. And one of the kind of classic opposition arguments is immigrants are taking our jobs, right? I mean, it's to be
Right.
clear, it's a
Right.
highly problematic and xenophobic argument, but I'm wondering how this fits together because if you
Hmm.
have folks in the United States, um, immigrant or otherwise, right, who are feeling that they need to take on that second or maybe third job, but then you have this convenient group of people who are being blamed
Yes.
for the lack of jobs when actually so
Yes.
it's smoke and mirrors, right? I haven't seen where those narratives have come together in a way
Hmm.
to kind of illuminate the lack of jobs is not really got much to do with immigration as much as it's got to do with jobs don't pay enough. So people have to have multiple jobs, right? So you have a single person who has three jobs and you replicate that a million times, right? That is like
Yeah.
taking
Yeah.
jobs from the labor market. So, I mean,
Right.
I realize it's
Right.
not just one thing, right? But I think that's a
Yeah.
really interesting way to think about how these narratives fit together and how that's changing as it relates to what a college degree can give you. And then shoot, let's just layer on top of
Hmm.
that all the debt that people get into, right? All
Debt.
of the debt.
That's where I was going. Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So that's what was
Absolutely.
coming up for me when you were talking, and I was thinking about this after looking at the research on it.
Yeah. Yeah. And, it's what I think is interesting is, you know, unfortunately, there is this conundrum where you have people that, do have college degrees or they do have some type of even professionalized level degree, and they still need, because of their whatever situations that are complex, um, it still requires them to do more than the match, if you will.
Right.
So, you know, uh, I just see a big like grid in my mind, Lisa, when it comes to the data points on this, where you have people that are, their salaries are kind of hanging out pretty average, but literally everything is more expensive. So you
Yeah.
have, food is more expensive, housing is more expensive. If you went to school for a degree of any level, then most likely you have some level of debt that still needs to be repaid.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Depending on your situation, you may not be. I was looking at some data points around uh, marriage and cohabitation and how that connects with need and so forth. Well, what happens when, you do have to fend for yourself, or you're
Yeah.
someone that's in that kind of sandwich generation like I am, where you have children that you're taking care of, and you also have parents and grandparents that you're taking care of. And so when everything costs more, then you have to do more in order to compensate for
Mm-hmm.
this. And so, I think I also see that too, Lisa. You know how much I love keeping up with the conversations around intergenerational workplaces, homes,
Yeah.
everything
Yeah.
intergenerational. And what I think is really interesting is when Lisa and I are Gen Xers. So imagine us trying to explain to our parents that may have bought homes for X amount of dollars, that what we make, which on paper looks like two, maybe three times more than they made in their lifetimes, and we still can't afford to do certain things. Like
Yeah.
that is a
Yeah.
whole conversation that I've been seeing come up, pretty regularly. And interestingly enough, when you start seeing those stats about younger generations, let's say they're fresh out of college, or maybe even, a decade or more out of college, and they still make a conscious decision to go home or create a family situation where it's an intergenerational household, because that's what everyone can afford and can experience better, rather than everyone being dispersed and on their own. It's not a younger generations don't want to work, or younger generations don't want to find gainful employment, or the stereotype of the younger generation that's falling asleep with the TV on and chips down their shirt, and they fell asleep on the couch because they're not working and they're playing video games all night. No, it is, I literally can only afford to go to work, my first job, my second job, and possibly my third job, sleep, shower, and then that's it, right? I mean, there's like, how much can you really afford to do at that point? It's not the stereotype of intergenerational households anymore. It's by necessity, we have to work together and collaborate so that we can all exist at a certain level.
I'd be interesting to see if there's a correlation between intergenerational living and multiple having of jobs, right?
Oh, yep, yep, yep.
So like not the people like the cabinet at that university where they have side hustles, right? And the side hustle is not
Yes.
is not a financial thing, but where it is a financial necessity, economic need.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and the degree to which there's an overlap between I'm living with my parents and my grandparents and my children, and I
Uh-huh.
also have two jobs, and that's the only way that we are able to afford, so that we're not living paycheck to paycheck, right? Like the second job and the
Mm-hmm.
multi-generational
Mm-hmm.
living is what creates the breathing room. And
That's
that would
right.
be, I'd be curious to know if there's an overlap there, and then I'd be curious to
Mm-hmm.
know um how that breaks down in terms of race and gender and other identity markers, because I think that would be interesting, and see if that's changed over
Mm.
time to what you're saying, right?
Oh,
Um,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
the other
Mm-hmm.
thing that you made me
Mm-hmm.
think of when you were talking, Shauna, was that I think uh Gen Z, I think, is the first generation that is unlikely to make more than their parents. So,
Oh, wow. Mm-hmm.
baby boomers to Gen X, like the Gen X, so us, we were able to accrue wealth and income that was greater than our parents, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then
Mm-hmm.
Gen Xers have Gen Z tend to be Gen Z or Gen Alpha kids, right? And
Right.
that generation is predicted to be the first generation in a while that will not accrue or progress economically beyond what their
Mm.
parents have. So it's
Mm-hmm.
like, so
Mm-hmm.
there's been a stifling of economic opportunity and growth,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
which I think is
Mm-hmm.
really interesting. So that would be your kids, right? So your kids might be
Yeah.
looking and staring down a future where they may not be as economically successful as you because of all the stuff that's going on. So then I'm thinking about,
Mm-hmm. Yep.
will they be living with you into their 30s
Absolutely
and 40s?
not. Absolutely not. But
And
anyway, go ahead.
will they have to have 3 or 4 jobs, Like, so
Uh-huh.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's different. I mean, we don't have a crystal ball, but it is really interesting because that undergraduate degree that they, if they choose to do that and get that, isn't going to be
Mm-hmm.
the key. It's definitely not going to be the key.
No, no, not at all. Not at all. It's not going to be the key. And it's not going to, how can I say? The many conversations about trying to build generational wealth, to me, it just dissipates when you have these conversations because at that point you're just trying to break even.
Right.
And that's one
Right.
of the reasons why I was so very, adamant about, as much as I would love for my sons to get into some really uh, strong academic programs for colleges and universities. No. I mean, I want them to get into strong programs, but not at the sacrifice of the debt that comes along with it.
Mm,
Because my brain, when it comes to this, gig economy and side hustles and so forth, most people that I know that are college educated, their kind of top three expenses are home mortgage if they've bought a home. Mortgage or rent. If they have children, childcare, and their student loans. And
right.
so, as a parent, am I more responsible by having them to go to the top program in the country for what they want to do and walk across the stage at the end of it with unconscionable debt, or have them go to, let's just say, a top 10, top 20 program and walk away debt free? I'm
Hmm.
going with the top 10 debt free at this point because think about how many people, and Lisa, I even think about, we talked about this on the podcast once where there was a woman in her 70s in the New York Times that said that she had been paying faithfully on her student loans for years as a teacher,
Yeah.
a K through 12 teacher. And she got to a point where she gave up and said, I'll never be able to pay this off. I don't
Right.
want that for my kids.
Yeah. I mean, especially when we're thinking about, you know, would be great for them to just have one job, right? But if when you add that student loan debt in, it just makes it even more challenging.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, are we, that's another study for another day, Lisa. You may know better than I do, but I'm like, are we the only country on the planet, even pre 45, 47 administration, are we the only country on the planet that expects people to work more than one full-time job to be able to survive? I'm not even saying thrive yet, just to survive. We are
Yeah, I don't
very
know. Yeah, I
sick
don't
when it
know.
comes to that. I mean, we're
I
we're
don't
very
know.
we're very sick when it comes to that in this country of normalizing overwork. Part
Yeah,
of
I
it
think
is
over,
the numbers, part of it is the culture.
yeah, and overemployment is here to stay, and perhaps is,
Yes. Yes.
Lionized in some circles, right? It's really great, good work ethic, good for you, which is ridiculous. But anyway, I
Yeah.
think it's lots to pay attention to, particularly in today's economic environment. Thinking about
Hmm.
that second or third job, but what you're saying connects a little bit to phase two. So let's go ahead and move into that. Okay. So phase two said in phase one, we're sick. We're sick. It's our culture, I think was what you just said.
I sure did. Yes, yes,
And
yes. Sick. We
so
are.
this phase two is dealing with healthcare, which has come up a gazillion times already on this podcast. Because so I think I missed my calling and should have been a constitutional lawyer because I just love this stuff. And so this is my little constitutional corner because the Supreme Court has struck again. In that earlier in April, they heard a case that was challenging the Affordable Care Act. So if you remember, the Affordable Care Act was passed by President Barack Obama in 2010. And one of its provisions is that preventative care is covered at no cost. So insurance companies are required to cover certain preventative care. Now, to determine what is preventative care or preventive care, and kind of the list of procedures that insurance companies have to cover, there is a task force, and it's called the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force. The members are 16 members. They're volunteers, and they're appointed by the Secretary of Health and Human Services. So that would be RFK Jr. right now, but obviously historically hasn't always been him. And that group makes determinations about what is or is not preventive care and what insurance companies must or must not cover. So when we think about preventive care, we're talking about breast cancer screenings, colon cancer screenings, certain medications, cholesterol screenings, things like that, right? And there is a couple of employers in Texas, shocker, who are challenging this because one of the drugs that is covered under this preventive screening requirement is pre-exposure prophylaxis, so PrEP, which is a drug you can take to minimize or prevent exposure to HIV if you're sexually active. And these two employers plus like 5 additional or 6 additional people from Texas. I'm not really sure. I haven't dug into who these additional people from Texas are, but the 2 employers are saying that it is against their religious belief to cover the cost through their insurance connections, right? Because it's employer-based insurance, to cover the cost of this PrEP. And I'll quote you here in their brief to the court was that they believed that doing so would facilitate and encourage homosexual behavior, prostitution, sexual promiscuity, and intravenous drug use. That is what they're believing, right? So anyway, this case was heard at the Supreme Court. And it's actually not about a freedom. It's not a freedom of religion argument. They are going after that committee. They're saying that that committee is unconstitutional because they should be appointed by the president, because they are like senior or principal officers that are making these decisions that could affect the economy. So they're saying this group of 16 volunteers in HHS is unconstitutional. Now, if the Supreme Court finds this group unconstitutional, it could undo all of their decisions back to 2010. So the stakes are pretty high. So among the services that would be implicated in this case are no cost coverage for statins, which are something that lowers cholesterol, colonoscopies for 45 to 49-year-olds, PrEP, which we just talked about, medications to lower the risk of breast cancer for women, and lung cancer screenings for smokers. That's not all of the things, but that's many of the things that would be potentially impacted. And this could impact over 150 million US Americans. So it's pretty far reaching on this technical kind of, these 16 people on this committee are overstepping, right? The media that covered the hearing that happened is mixed. So some media outlets are saying the Supreme Court seems poised to uphold this task force that determines what preventive care should be covered. And then other media outlets are saying, well, you've got your three liberal appointed folks, so Sotomayor,
Mm-hmm.
Jackson, and Kagan, and then you've got
Mm-hmm.
Alito, Gorsuch, and Thomas on the no, and then you've got this Kavanaugh, Roberts, Coney Barrett group in the middle, and they're not sure where this
Middle.
what they're going, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So we won't find out the answer to this, Shauna, until June of next year. But what it
Okay.
prompted me to think about was just US healthcare, right? And so I looked up some stats, which I'm sure we've probably talked
Yes.
about on the pod before. For the
Mm-hmm.
US healthcare system is the most expensive healthcare system than any of its kind of like equivalent industrialized Western countries.
Mm-hmm.
And in some cases, not even just Western countries, right?
Mm-hmm.
But has the lowest or some of the lowest health outcomes for people who live in the United States.
Horrible.
For
Horrible.
example, lower life expectancy, a higher rate of infant and maternal mortality, a higher rate of deaths from preventable or treatable causes, higher rates of chronic disease, then
Mm-hmm.
also less doctors. So people have less access to doctors in the United
Mm-hmm.
States, right? But we're spending all this money on healthcare.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and now potentially these preventive services could
Mm-hmm.
go out the window, meaning people would have to pay for them, right? Or
Yeah.
insurance companies. So people would have to pay out of pocket, or insurance companies wouldn't have to cover them. And what blows my effing mind here is that preventive services are the things that keep healthcare costs down, right?
Exactly. Exactly. Underline and highlight prevention. Hello.
So this group of 7 or 8 people in Texas want to screw this up for everyone
Yeah. Yep.
because they don't feel like they should have to pay through their employer-based insurance coverage for PrEP. Because
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's just unbelievable to me,
Mm-hmm.
Shauna. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the court case, on kind of the larger issue of the US healthcare system and the ways in which we do not do enough in terms of preventive medicine.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yep. Yep. Well, a few things I'm thinking about with this is we literally can't afford to be sick in this country. Like we literally
right,
can't afford to be sick in
right.
this country. And so when we think about the entire ecosystem that constitutes our health. I mean, uh, you know, given that you brought up Texas earlier, you know, you and I both know we've had a client in Texas specifically that works on, thank goodness, health equity. And they
Mm-hmm,
even warned
mm-hmm.
us coming into those conversations that, hey, by the way, wink, wink, nod, nod, you can't say social determinants of health, the phrase that is overwhelmingly accepted as this ecosystem that creates our health. So, for those that are not experts in social determinants of health, just imagine, for example, it's not hard to imagine because all you have to do is watch the news, the air you breathe that directly affects your health and livelihood, the water you drink that directly
Mm-hmm.
affects your health and livelihood, how much exercise you're able to get because you have spaces where you can go safely exercise or you can spend time outside to get fresh air. All food deserts that we've talked about, Lisa, in
Mm-hmm.
regards to how far do you have to go to get fresh produce, for example? That's just not something that it's just available to everyone. I
Right,
remember,
right.
Lisa, when people got very upset in a particular area of DC where they were closing I believe it was a Whole Food store, but I don't want to completely say that, but it was a grocery store that was the only one within a certain mile radius that had any fresh produce. Now, you can go to a corner store, you can go to a bodega, you can go to, a 7-Eleven to get some things if you're in a pinch, but when you're talking about food that sustains you and that is good for your body, you're not going to
Yep.
find it there. And so when you're dealing with folks that don't want to talk about the entire ecosystem that constitutes what our health looks like, then they're in major denial. Once again, we have folks that do not want to use systems thinking to get it right. And so when I'm thinking about, for example, Lisa, goodness gracious, the hypocrisy is killing me right now because, these are folks that want to say that paying for certain things, they may not be directly saying it, but they're hinting at the notion that they don't want their money to pay for certain things, whether it's religiously based or values based or what have you. I'm thinking to myself, there's not one religious community, denomination, or set of tenets on the planet that doesn't want people to be healthy in all forms,
Right.
physically, mentally, emotionally, etc. So to think that this type of effort works against their religion when it actually, in my humble opinion, will work for it. The
Mm-hmm.
lack of critical and systems thinking is always just my brain just wants to explode every time I hear these conversations. And so, with that, they're worried about having to quote unquote pay for it. Guess what? Everybody's going to be paying for it soon. Everybody's going to be paying for the
Mm.
bad outcome. We're all paying for it right now. Frankly, to be honest with you, we're all paying for it now. That's how you get those outcomes where we're the most expensive but the least effective in our outcomes.
Yeah.
When, that we're paying for it right now.
Mm-hmm.
So, with that, I do think it's quite hypocritical. And once again, I'm just struck by the lack of systems thinking in all of it when it comes to this work. So, oh,
Yeah, it's an individual. This is a violation of my religious rights, but they're not the argument. What's interesting, the argument that is in their brief that it's a violation, but
yeah.
they're not going after preventive care shouldn't be
Hmm.
covered. They're going after it via this group, right? And so I
This
think
particular
that
group.
maybe they felt that that was the stronger argument because the Supreme Court
Hmm.
has made has had other cases where I could see why they would think that. But interestingly, the Trump
Hmm.
administration is defending this group. So the Trump administration tried to repeal the Affordable Care Act in the first term, right? And you remember that
Right.
famous
Right.
Senator John McCain was the final vote, and he did that classic thumbs down that saved the Affordable
Yes.
Care Act.
Yes.
And then you also had in 2012, before
Hmm.
that, Chief Justice John Roberts sided with the kind of liberal bloc on the bench and upheld the Affordable Care Act. It's been on the chopping block for conservatives for a very long time, the Affordable Care Act, because God forbid we actually provide
Hmm.
any kind of semblance of universal health care, which the Affordable Care Act isn't, right?
Exactly.
But
Oh,
it's
not
like
even close. Yeah.
it's inching slightly closer than where we were before the Affordable Care Act. So I think it's just curious that they've decided to go after it this way, but that the Trump administration is defending it kind of blew my mind a little bit because I thought maybe they would be silent on it or withdraw from defending it. But they're saying no,
Hmm.
this task
Hmm.
force they're not principal officers, they're inferior officers, and the HHS secretary can step in, can overrule what they decide.
Hmm.
So I'm not
Hmm.
sure what the I feel like there's probably some ulterior motive somewhere in there,
You
but
took the words right out of my
okay.
mouth. Yeah, I was going to
Yeah.
say what that this is the little boom that they're surprising us that they don't want to fool with it. What's the big boom? The big
Yeah.
boom down the road, a lot of people are saying is that they want to completely wipe this out and, privatize it anyway. So
Yeah.
further privatize. So yeah, I'm I'm like you, Lisa. Anytime I'm pleasantly surprised by something within this administration, I'm bracing myself for what that's placating before the real challenge comes up. I think
Yeah.
this would be
Because
convenient. This would be
yeah.
very convenient.
Yeah, there's no way that the Trump administration would argue in favor of this task force if there wasn't if there wasn't something else going on. I'm just not exactly sure what that is yet. But I
Yeah,
think,
yeah.
these Texans, why I why not just go after PrEP then? Why not just file a lawsuit and say we don't want to have to pay
Hmm.
for PrEP in the same way that Hobby Lobby did related to contraception, right? They didn't want
Yes.
to pay. Like, why not do that? So why are you
Hmm.
wanting to take down the whole thing
Hmm.
via this preventive task force rather than just say I shouldn't have to pay for this drug because this drug violates my Christian religious principles, right? Like So there definitely feels like there's something bigger going on here, and it's just this ongoing attack on the Affordable Care Act, which is shocking. Well, shocking, not shocking, right? But
Yeah, I wonder if I wonder if even it kind of reminds me when you have an attorney in court that says something and then they withdraw it, like you can't unsay it, you heard it, right?
mm,
And so it kind of reminds me of that where it's like we might be very aware that no, you know, this given that the lower courts found the task force unconstitutional, if SCOTUS agrees upholds that, even if it doesn't uphold that, frankly, the longer game is that it's now under enough scrutiny that people have to look at
right,
it line by line by line, even
right.
if SCOTUS doesn't, if they do uphold it or if they don't. People are still now shining a light on it. And sometimes I feel like these cases are brought up in order to shine a light on something, a little something, so that we get to the larger issue because we've already critiqued the problems. And it's like, oh, you're pointing out one big problem. Oh, let's overhaul it. I mean, like that would be like the doorstep
Right,
to the big
right.
boom to me. So sometimes these cases are just brought in place just so people will look a little more closely to garner the attention and sound the alarm prior to
Hmm.
whatever larger is going to happen. So I think that could be playing the longer game, even though this is like, lose, what is it? Lose the battle and win the war type feel. Like
Right,
they
right.
might be very okay if this doesn't go through because they got the next
'Cause
thing cooking,
yeah, that's a
you
good
know?
point. Yeah. So we'll hear in June, July-ish around that. But you know,
Hmm.
a friend of mine had a few years ago had colon cancer. And so she's been a real advocate for people getting their colonoscopies. And it wasn't until fairly recently that people in that
Yeah.
45 to 49-year-old age group were allowed to have those colonoscopies covered by insurance, right? As a
Yes.
preventive case, because the number
Yes.
of people who are getting colon cancer in their 40s has increased alarmingly. Um,
Hmm.
but like
Hmm.
in the UK, it's not that 45 to 49 thing isn't a thing. Like, I don't even know if my brother and sister-in-law have even had one, and they're in their mid
Hmm.
50s. So,
Ah, gotcha.
you
Gotcha.
know, which again, going back to my first point, preventative medicine will save healthcare systems money. So give people all the preventive things because then you'll catch stuff earlier, which means you will not have massive amounts
Hello.
of medical costs later and you'll save lives, right? Like, um,
Oh, Lisa saving lives. I mean,
what are we
who
doing,
thought of
right?
that?
Yeah.
That's not a priority around here,
I know. So this colon
Yeah,
cancer
yeah,
thing is
yeah.
particularly scary to me because we just got that. And that has
Hmm.
probably already saved some lives because it's probably already caught the beginnings of cancer for people in their mid to upper 40s that would have otherwise just been growing until they got to their
Yes.
50s, you know?
That's right. Exactly. Exactly. That's right. Well, and I think about a number, like, for example, the breast cancer piece of things. Now, Lisa, we've already gone there in regards to specifically Black women and birth rates and mortality
Mm-hmm.
rates and so forth with Black
Yep.
women. Lisa, I honestly could give you a list of 8 to 10 Black women right now off the top of my head that were younger than the usual mammogram age, but because they were pregnant at the time, they were able to get a scan and they found out some not so great news that was caught due to their
Mm-hmm.
pregnancy. And I keep thinking to myself, what if those friends, family of mine, they constantly say their baby saved their life because they wouldn't have been
Yeah.
able to find out about the lump or whatever else was going on, dense tissue, all those conversations. They wouldn't have found that out if they weren't having a baby.
Mm-hmm.
They might not be here. And so, if you don't have that preventative care, especially for those demographics like my own, that already have a higher rate of everything, whether it's a diabetes or other things, yeah, I see how this affects everyone, every American negatively. And then it really goes back, Lisa, to what we've talked about before when the world gets a cold, Black folks get pneumonia. Like it feels that way all the time. Where like, yeah, it's not great for everyone, but it's horrible for particular groups of people.
Yep.
Um, if we don't say
Yep.
something and intervene. So yeah,
Yeah. So the other thing I didn't say earlier
incredible.
was the US has some of the biggest racial and socioeconomic health disparities among its peers. And
Hmm.
so that is just going to get exacerbated, and socioeconomic
That's
status,
right.
right?
That's
Insurance is
right.
no longer going to pick up those out of pocket costs. Like a breast cancer screening can be in the hundreds of dollars, a colon cancer screening can be in the thousands, right? So, and even if you have insurance, which we know many people do not, a copay could be $75. And that is, given what we just talked about with people having to take on 2 or 3 jobs and live in intergenerational living, that might not be something they can do. So
That's exactly right.
this is going to be a big deal. So listeners, pay attention.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm. Yeah, Lisa,
and
you got me
yeah,
thinking about all the folks that we know that, let's say they do have their own business or their side hustle that they want to be more than a side hustle, and they could actually blow it up into something bigger, but the cost of healthcare
right.
requires them to keep that 9 to 5, even if it's
Yep.
just for the
Yep.
healthcare alone.
Exactly.
It
Exactly.
all it does loop together very nicely, really
Yeah.
nicely. Hmm.
All
Yeah.
right. Well, on that note, let's wrap it up.
Yes, absolutely. Because we always end on a positive note around here,
I
y'all.
know
You
we're
know we
so bad
do.
at that. Yeah.
Well, I will say I appreciate folks hanging in there with us as we pay attention to what's going on with SCOTUS, because Lisa does such a phenomenal job keeping us on target with when to expect decisions to be made so that we can do things prior to the decision being made. We can let
Right.
people know, hey, we agree, we disagree. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So that is it for this week's episode of Unfazed Unedited. Please don't forget that you can reach us on all of your social media, podcast apps, and platforms that you already use, at Unfazed Unedited. You can email us at info@unfazedpodcast.com, or just go to our website, unfazedpodcast.com, where you'll access both the old and the new shows, because we're creeping up closer to 200. So trust me, we got tons for you to listen to. If you liked this week's episode, please make sure that you actually physically click the like, like, subscribe, leave a review, and share with your friends, coworkers, or others in this phase of your life. So, Dr. Lisa, until next time.
All right. See you next time.